Our next speaker was in charge as Deputy Attorney General of the security in 1965, 50 years ago, for the Selma to Montgomery March, the third march, which actually got to Montgomery. And I understand that he also got a call from Dr. Martin Luther King after he gave his speech here in 1967, because Dr. King was very concerned that the press would try to distort what he had to say. And he wanted to make sure that he at least had one reliable legal representative that would not misrepresent what his intent was and his intent that day was. Besides those particular distinctions, he's always stood for justice. Matter of fact, he stood for justice in the case of Lyndon LaRouche, as many of you here know. And he stood for justice over and over, all over the world. It's always an honor to have him speak. And he can only be here for a few minutes with us today. So I'd like, and it's always my honor, to introduce former Attorney General of the United States, Ramsey Clark.
In his speech in this church in 1967, I guess it was, I'll correct myself if I search and find otherwise, Dr. King said some words that hurt him deeply and personally, but he felt had to be said. And they were these: the greatest purveyor of violence on earth is my own country. It hurt him palpably to say it, but it was a truth he felt deeply, and he said it. The next day, a couple of lawyer friends of his showed up, and they had a copy of the speech. And they said, Dr. King wanted to be sure I had an accurate copy of what he really said. And it was that the greatest purveyor of violence on earth is my own country. Conditions haven't changed globally in that particular, I'm afraid. We remain the greatest purveyor of violence on earth. We glorify its power and ignore its pity. Just look at our entertainment, our war films and our crime films. And it's like we've got a love affair with violence. And yet the words he spoke here will win the struggle if human life is to endure on this planet. And I'm an optimist. I'm sure it will, at least from our own hand, which is the cruelest fate of all. The first night out, I was sent down to Montgomery, Alabama, about 4 days before the march started. I was Deputy Attorney General at the time, which is on the organization chart the second highest ranking officer in the department requires presidential nomination and Senate confirmation. And my assignment was to protect the order of a U.S. federal judge who had prescribed the fashion in which people could march from Selma to Montgomery along a public highway. And it was litigated for quite a while and came up with the solution that 50 people could be chosen and march two abreast. If you see the movie Selma, which I recommend, but the movie Selma is about Selma. It's about the courage and beauty of the people there who were tired of a sheriff who liked to walk his horses over their bodies. A man named Clark, no relation that I'm aware of, or if there is, I disclaim it now. Not that had I been in his shoes, I might have been the same. But the march was an interesting occasion in studying the character, the moral character of our society. The FBI, which always requires someone who wants to know the truth to be carefully observed in its statements, told me that there were 1,200 men who had served lengthy convictions in prison for white racist crime against African Americans who had come to the Selma Montgomery area, 1,200. They're out of prison now, and they had rifles on the rack in the back of the cabin of their pickup trucks. And the Bureau, whose assumptions I don't usually follow, was that they intended to use those rifles if they got a chance. We brought a diversity of law enforcement into that area that was certainly unprecedented in this country in terms of its diversity, in terms of its magnitude. In terms, we had 10,000 standing by in reserve. It'd taken maybe 48 hours to get into action. But we had Border Patrol and U.S. Marshals, and to the extent that we could rely on them, some state and local agents and Army standing by for 50 people to do under a court order, which was litigated for about a year and a half before you could undertake the project in a free society, to do something that no one in his right mind would want to do unless someone dared him to, and that was walk from Selma to Montgomery. I remember John Doerr got so sunburned I thought he was going to lose his nose. Even though it was in March, the sun was really hot down there. Top of my ears got blistered, and my nose is bigger than his, and it got more blistered than his, but I couldn't see it as well as I could see his. And the fear was palpable. The first night we got across the bridge, I nearly lost my job because I was standing on the far side of the Raymond Pettis Bridge by a Border Patrol car. I always like Border Patrolmen because they're kind of cowboys, and they work independently, and they don't have a director of the FBI who's making them dress like they're on Wall Street or someplace, and go in pairs because they're afraid. I was standing by this Border Patrol car with an open mic to about 6 other Border Patrol cars that were stationed all around so we could talk to each other immediately. And they started across the bridge, and I made the unfortunate error of saying, "Here they come, isn't it beautiful?" Monday morning, this was Sunday, Monday morning, the New York Times headline is Deputy Attorney General down there to be neutral and protect the marchers from the public and the public from the marchers. At the point at which the marchers started over the bridge, said, "Look at that, isn't it beautiful?" For which some of my superiors were uncomplimentary about my verbiage. But it was beautiful. The idea that it would take a force of that magnitude to, and it wouldn't really, but it would take a pretty good force to make it safe. To do something that no one in his right mind would want to do anyway, and that is march from Selma to Montgomery, even though it's March, in the month of March as well as a Marching month, broiling sun. And the first night we got out to, I'd talked to the farmer myself, we'd leased some land, we paid him some money so we could stay on his land, because we didn't want to have, some conflict about, hey, get off my property. There weren't other places that were as convenient. And I've forgotten what I paid him, but maybe $500 or something for 50 people to spend the night on his land on the ground, or most of them had sleeping bags, something like that. We got there and he said, "Can't do it. You can't come on my land. I've been threatened, and it's getting to be dark." But I've been up and down that road so many times I knew every foot of it, and there was a state park. It wasn't a mile and a half or 2 miles further down the road, so we just went on down there. And I set up sentries to march around the campers. We set up some 4-foot sidewall army tents and had sleeping bags for the 50. And so about 11 o'clock, Dr. King grabbed me and we walked away from the crowd. We were sitting around fires, and we had these sentries. It looked like a Civil War scene to me. And he said, "I think you've been told I've got to fly to Chicago in the morning." I said, "No, I haven't been told." He said, "Yeah, I'm going to leave here about 3 in the morning, so I'm going to sleep now." I kind of fussed at him and said, "You got to tell me when you're going to do those things, because I want to be sure you're safe, man. You can't be driving yourself or having somebody drive you down that road by yourself without protection." But we were by this tent. We were looking down. It looked like a Civil War scene here in the United States of America in 1965, with campfires and sentries marching around the 50 people. And there's only one of the 50 that slept any that night, as far as I could tell, and that was I didn't. I wasn't one of the 50, but I was supposed to be in charge of their safety. It was kind of ridiculous in itself. I'd been a Marine corporal and a life scout, Boy Scout, but I wasn't a professional in the field of protection. He got up and left and got back Monday night, but the other marchers didn't really sleep that night. They sat around the campfire and they talked and thought, and some of them came up and got in the tents for a while. And we marched on. Hard to believe that the palpable fear of violence and the actuality of risk. I have no idea whether there are really 1,200 men with felony convictions for racist violence, all white, all the men that were there with their guns on racks behind them, most of them in pickups. Were there and had the will to shoot, but I was flying a plane back that Friday after we'd gotten to Montgomery, and all the speechifying had gone on in front of the Capitol. And it was a little Army plane, about a 12-passenger plane, but they had a door between. The pilot came back and said, "Got a phone message for you." So I went up in the cockpit and listened. They said that a woman had been killed on the way back to Selma. She was taking some of the people who'd come over for the march from Selma, that lived in Selma, wanted to go home. back and was shot and killed. So we turned the plane around, flew back to Montgomery, and tried to see what we could do to show our sorrow and prevent further violence under pretty tense situation still. There were about 25,000 people that came from outside of Alabama to participate or just to stand there and watch. There was a big crowd out in front of the Capitol. Watch the speeches and all after the end of the march. You wonder how much it's really changed. You hope for the best, but you go to our prisons and you see they're overwhelmingly, disproportionately African American males, young, very young. Lives of freedom for them terminated, at least temporarily, of the length of their prison sentence, and probably at least freedom of will and mind and spirit badly damaged for the rest of their lives. Because we haven't found the capacity to love each other yet, and particularly when we have different colors of skin, which in my view doesn't tell you anything about what's underneath, except another human spirit. And we know of so many who were so great. Dr. King's spirit will prevail for societies, not just ours, in the spirits of many, many people for as long as our form of communication endures.